and thank you so much for making the time to come join us today. We have got a very, I think, interesting set of presentations and panel discussion for you, and we really do encourage a lot of discussion with you as well. We will have a lunch after the event as well, so we hope there's an opportunity for some chance to meet each other and talk about these important issues. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just quickly give you a few comments about what this panel is, and it really represents the work of about 6 years of active research in the United States, in China, and in India. At the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, we've been studying American public opinion for over a decade, and very extensively since about 2008. Just about 2 years ago, we were very fortunate to find our good friends, Dr. Zheng Baowei and Ms. Wang Binbin, who were in the process of forming a China Center for Climate Change Communication. And we found each other, and it's been a wonderful partnership ever since. It's been such a great opportunity to become their friends as well as to work with them in China. And at the same time, we started a project looking at how Indians were responding to climate change as well. And Dr. Jagadish Thaker worked very closely with me over several years to do that study as well. So what all of us are really trying to understand are the answers to a few basic questions. What do mass publics in the United States, China, and India understand and misunderstand about the causes, the consequences, and the potential solutions to climate change? How do they perceive the risks, so the likelihood and the severity of different kinds of impacts? What kinds of climate and energy-related behaviors are they engaged in? What would they like to engage in? And what are the barriers that prevent them from changing their behavior? And last but not least is their political support for action. Will they support the political leaders that need to be bold and take serious action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Will they support the policies that are needed to both reduce emissions as well as to start preparing for now the inevitable impacts of climate change? And of course, as scientists, and we are all scientists here, we're interested in answering the question, why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, political reasons why some people become very engaged with the issue of climate change and demand action, and other people ignore or even deny or dismiss climate change as a serious concern? So again, here we're going to be highlighting some of the results of our work in these 3 countries. You can see the agenda. We're going to cover a bunch of ground. Professor Zheng will give a few introductory remarks, and I'll talk about what's happening in the United States. Then we'll look at China. Then we'll do a few comparisons. We actually have a few questions that were similarly asked in both countries, and they are starting to reveal some interesting comparisons, though we're just starting that process. Then we'll look at what's happening in India, and then we'll have a panel discussion about what are some of the insights of this research for climate communicators and educators going forward. So with that, I'd like to now turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Zheng Baowei.
各位嘉宾、各位朋友、女士们、先生们，大家上午好！欢迎大家今天参加我们的辩会。这次辩会是由耶鲁大学气候传播项目和中国气候传播项目中心共同主办的。刚才耶鲁大学的安东尼教授做了很好的致辞。在此呢，我也代表中国气候传播项目中心，对各位嘉宾和朋友参加我们的会议表示热烈欢迎和衷心感谢。中美2个气候传播项目的研究机构合作举办这次辩会，充分显示了传播与沟通的意义。可以说，今天的辩会本身就是传播与交流的结果。我们中国气候传播项目中心自从2010年4月成立以来，就一直在关注其他国家学者的相关研究，期待与国外同行开展交流合作。因为当前气候变化已 经成了一个全球性的议题，而应对气候变化也是一个需要全人类关注和全球治理的问题。在全球化时代，沟通交流、合作共赢是必然的选择。在气候变化与气候传播领域也是这样，它不仅需要各国政府的联合行动，也需要加强学术界的沟通与合作，形成研究气候变化和气候传播的学术共同体。正是在这一背景下，我们中国气候传播项目中心和耶鲁大学气候传播项目实现了学术交流和科研合作。为了学习借鉴耶鲁大学的研究经验，今年年初我们中心特意派出李玉杰前往耶鲁大学访问学习。4月，我和中心执行主任王彬彬访问了耶鲁大学，商谈合作事宜。今年6月，我们中国气候传播项目中心成立顾问委员会，特别聘请安东尼教授担任顾问委员会的委员。在我们进行中国公众气候变化与气候传播认知状况调查的过程中，得到了安东尼教授及其团队的学术支持，在此我们深表感谢。整体看来，发展中国家进行公众气候变化认知调研和开展气候传播研究还处在起步阶段，所以我们所做的这次中国公众气候变化与气候传播认知状况调查具有一定的探索和开拓意义。今后在这方面我们还有许多工作需要跟进。我想，尽管各个国家的国情不同，比如我们今天编会讨论所涉及到的美国、中国和印度3个国家，各自遭受气候变化影响的程度不同，公众的认知状况也各有差别。但我认为在学术上进行比较研究还是很有价值的，因为我们研究的目的是一致的，都是为了提升各国公众的气候变化意识，推动公众参与应对气候变化的行动。全球应对气候变化是为了给全人类创造一个天蓝、地绿、水净的美好家园，建设一个美丽世界，让我们的地球家园和我们的世界更加美丽。而这个目标的实现需要各国共同的努力，也需要在座各位的努力。再次感谢大家对我们编会的关注和支持、参与，期待编会能够圆满成功。谢谢大家。
Okay, so thanks again, everyone. We're going to start with a look at what's happening inside the United States. So there has been a series of major shifts in climate change in the American mind, as we like to title this project. And what we've been doing is studying, again, how Americans are responding to this issue over the past decade. What I'm going to do here is show you some of the results from about the past 5 years worth of research. And it's going to illustrate a couple major trends that I think have had a major impact on the political climate of climate change in the United States, and helps to explain why the United States has been so reluctant to take more aggressive action on climate change up to this point. So again, these are all nationally representative surveys. I'm happy to talk about the underlying methodology with anyone who wants to know, but I'm not going to bore you with those details at the moment. But let's take a look at some of the important findings. So first of all, this is a basic question of, do you believe that global warming is happening or not? Okay? And what we found is that there was essentially a high water mark. The high level was back in 2008, when about 71% of Americans said yes, they believed that global warming was real. That then we saw a major drop of about 14 percentage points from 2008 to 2010. And by the way, this same exact trend was found by every other single survey research organization in the United States that asked the same question repeatedly over time. The same very significant downward trend. And you're going to see this trend showing up in a number of these slides. But since then, since that low point, it's slowly crawled back up until now when we are back at about 70% of the American public who again believe that climate change is happening. So this pattern, this V pattern of a major decline followed by a recovery or a rebound is a pattern we're going to see again. So this is, do you believe climate change is happening or not? And as you can see, a substantial number of Americans still, however, believe that it is not happening at all. Likewise, what do you believe is the cause of climate change? Here, I'm going to under a little bit. What we see here is that we had a high water mark or a top level at about 57% of Americans who said that climate change is mostly caused by human activities back in 2008, a 10-point drop to 2010, and then it has slowly come back up until just last September, just a few months ago, it is now back up to 54%. But you still have 30% of Americans who believe that if climate change is happening, it's caused by natural factors. Not anything that humans have done, not that humans can do anything about. Very important point. Again, a decline, and this is the question, do most scientists believe that global warming is happening? Now note, this question is not asking, do scientists think that climate change is human caused? This is not asking, do people think that climate change is a serious problem? This is just asking, do scientists agree that it's happening, about which there is no dispute. Even the most adamant skeptics or critics of climate science do not dispute that the climate is warming. And yet, even back at the high water mark, back in 2008, only 47%, less than half of Americans understood that. Now it is back up to 44%. And you still have 36% of Americans who believe there's a lot of disagreement among scientists that global warming exists. And there's even a small proportion, maybe about 5% of Americans, who think that scientists are actually agreed that it's not happening. This is not by accident, and I'll come back to this point later in the talk, but this key belief right here, that scientists are still in disagreement about the nature of the problem itself, is one of the major issues that still needs to be resolved in the United States. Okay, again, are Americans worried about climate change? Well, again, we kind of saw the highest levels of this back in 2008, when we had well over 50% of Americans saying that they were at least somewhat to very worried about this issue. Again, a major drop to 2010, and then slowly crawling back up until we're just now at about, 58% Americans who say that they're at least somewhat worried about this issue. But note, importantly, even now, 16%, only 16% of Americans say that they're very worried about this issue. And this has been a very consistent finding over many, many years. Yes, a majority of Americans do think it's happening, and they now do think that it's human caused, but they're not very worried about it. So why is that? Why aren't people worried about this issue? Well, there's a range of reasons, but one of the most important reasons that we've seen again and again and again is that for many Americans, they think of climate change as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space, that this is a problem that's going to impact polar bears or small island countries in the South Pacific, not the United States, not my state, not my community, not my friends and family, or the people of places that I care about. So it's one of these issues that's just out there someday, somewhere else, it'll be a serious problem, but they don't see how it's going to be relevant to their own lives. And thus it's not seen as a very important problem, and they don't worry about it that much. And how else does that show up? It shows up in political will. Public will and political will. This chart shows, and this is data from the Pew Research Center from the spring of 2012, Americans' top priorities for the President and Congress. And what you see, unsurprisingly, is economy and jobs are overwhelmingly the #1 priority. And since 2007, these numbers, 86% of Americans, 82% of Americans say these should be top priorities, and those numbers have grown dramatically. Not a big surprise why that is. Of course, 2008 is the exact moment when the whole world financial system threatens collapse. Where is global warming? Right here. All the way at the bottom. Only 25% of Americans say this should be one of the top priorities for the President and Congress. And since 2007, that has dropped 13 percentage points. Climate change has always been at the bottom of this list. How about the environment? The environment does a little better as a broader category. 43% of Americans say that should be a priority, but that too dropped 14 percentage points since 2007. How about energy? Here's energy. About half of Americans say that should be a top priority, but that too dropped 5 percentage points since 2007. Okay? So this fact that, okay, so a majority of Americans do believe that climate change is happening and human caused and that some action should be taken, but it's not seen as one of the top tier issues that people are going to vote on or that their elected officials should act on. Okay, so why did we see those declines since 2007, 2008? Well, we like to say this is a perfect storm. It's where a whole bunch of things all happened at once that really drove these numbers. It wasn't any one thing. But one, of course, is the economy and unemployment. Again, 2007, 2008 is when the real estate bubble popped in the United States. The economy and the world financial system was in crisis, and unemployment surged up over 10% in the United States. And it became, of course, one of the top issues that led to Barack Obama being elected in the fall of 2008. But what's also not fully recognized is that there was a major decline in media coverage in this issue. Okay? Now, my colleagues, Max Boykoff, has been tracking newspaper coverage in the United States. Newspaper coverage, and I'm just talking quantity of articles, not quality, not whether, how they're describing it and what the content of the story is or anything. Just number of articles that mention global warming or climate change has dropped since 2007 by about 2/3. Okay? And my colleague Bob Rule has been studying nightly network news coverage, so the major networks like CBS, ABC, NBC nightly news. That coverage has dropped by about 90%. Okay? Now this is an issue, climate change, that if there were a window here, we could all look out the window and there's CO2 pouring out of the smokestacks, out of the tailpipes, and out of the buildings. In fact, there's CO2 pouring out of all of us right now in this room. But you can't see it because it's invisible. And likewise, you can't see the impacts unless you've been trained and know where to look. So the only way the vast majority of Americans know about this issue, I mean, look, they don't know climate scientists, they don't read scientific journal reports. The only way they know about this is through media coverage. And when the media does not report this issue, it is literally out of sight and out of mind. Doesn't mean they've completely forgotten the idea of climate change, but it's just not salient. They're not being reminded of it. And this is why the media plays such an important role in shaping public consciousness. We also had some unusually cold weather events in the United States in these years. The United media does tend to sensationalize things, so they dubbed one of these snowpocalypse and the other one snowmageddon, big snowstorms. And we know that for those people who don't really know much about the issue and haven't really taken a firm position on it, they will draw on personal experience or recent experience to make up their mind about global warming. And so when they saw a massive snowstorm, some of them said, well, gosh, that doesn't seem like global warming. Even though that's, of course, completely consistent with climate change, but that's a harder scientific understanding that many people lack. We also have to recognize that there's been a pretty effective denial industry, which has been very well documented. A whole set of companies as well as think tanks that have very strong conservative free market ideology have been real leaders and actually quite effective communicators at raising public doubts about this issue, even about whether it's happening or human-caused or a serious problem. And of course, back in 2009, we had the ClimateGate, so-called scandal. And our own research has shown that scandal, in fact, did have a significant impact on public opinion. About 12% of Americans said they became less convinced that climate change is real, and more importantly, lost trust in climate scientists as messengers. But importantly, that effect was not spread across the entire country. It was highly concentrated among conservative Republicans who tend to watch Fox News and Rush Limbaugh. And when we went and looked at the media coverage, it turns out that the New York Times and the CBS Evening News would cover it a couple times. but on Fox News and on Russia talked about it again and again and again and again and again and again and again, and always with a very sinister interpretation. We also have to recognize there's been increasing political polarization on this issue in the United States, where we have Democrats and Republicans actually using climate change to attack each other. Okay? And I think that's a dynamic that you don't see in many other countries around the world. Okay, but then why have we seen the rebound in the past couple of years? What's been happening? Well, we're still trying to answer that question, but one of the things we know is that, first of all, the economy and unemployment are improving. People are feeling a little more confident about it, and they're beginning to pay more attention to other issues. But we've also seen a starting increase in media coverage. Nowhere back to the level we saw in 2007, but it's definitely starting to pick up again. And one of the reasons for that is that the United States has just endured 2 years of devastating, record-breaking extreme weather events. One after another, after another, after another. And what we've been documenting in our work is that Americans are paying attention to that. They're beginning to connect the dots themselves between climate change and these extreme weather events. So we've asked, do you think that global warming is affecting weather in the United States? And we find that a strong majority of Americans do think so. Okay. Likewise, we find that majorities agree that climate change has made a whole series of very specific extreme weather events that the United States has experienced recently worse. So the record high summer temperatures, record-setting temperatures across much of the United States last summer, large majorities say, yeah, they think climate change had something to do with that. The drought in the Midwest and the Great Plains, the unusually warm winter we had in 2011, 2012. For those of you that have ever been to Chicago, Illinois, it was in the about 85 degrees, I believe, in January, which is not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be probably more like 20 degrees in January in Chicago. We had record forest fires in the American West and a very unusual, what's called a derecho storm that blew through the East Coast. Okay? A whole series of one after another, after another, after another extreme weather events. And again, Americans are starting to think that they might be connected to something. Okay. And now let's turn to policy support. Well, one of the actually pieces of good news is though climate change may not be one of the top tier priorities for Americans, they have long been consistent supporters of national action on climate and energy. Okay? So these numbers are actually not unusual. We've seen these for a long time. There's been strong majority support, bipartisan support for Democrats and Republicans for funding more research into renewable energy sources like wind and solar. Very strong social consensus on that. Providing tax rebates for people who purchase energy-efficient vehicles or solar panels. Regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant, which unfortunately is now probably the main policy that the Obama administration is going to have to pursue, is having the EPA try to regulate CO2 by power plants. Interestingly, in the context of our negotiations here, eliminating all subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. You have a majority of Americans who actually support that. Okay? The fossil fuel industry is not particularly loved in the United States. People don't have positive feelings about the oil industry or big oil companies, as an example, and I think you see some of that in here. And then very interestingly, you do not have a majority supporting something like a carbon tax, but we're beginning to see that depending on what's done with the money from a carbon tax, you can actually get a majority of people in the United States to support it. So if that money was used, for example, was returned right back to taxpayers, they tend to support that. If is used to spur investments in clean energy and green jobs, they definitely support that. So the carbon tax, who knows? It's hard to believe that the United States could ever even think about passing a tax, but as we see right now, they're talking about raising revenues as part of the so-called fiscal cliff discussions. Also very interesting, and this has been a consistent finding over many years, is that when we ask Americans, should the United States reduce its that the U.S. should reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, a majority of them say we should do so regardless of what other countries do. Only 2% say that we should only do that if other industrialized countries do. Only 7% of Americans say we need to wait until both other industrialized and developing countries like China do. Okay. And only 5% just say no, not reduce our emissions at all. Okay. So this actually goes quite contradictory to the stated policy position of the United States for many years now, that we will not act until all the developing countries sign up as well. Okay? So the public isn't actually there. Now that doesn't mean the public is demanding that the negotiators pass a treaty, but this is their basic starting point. And more specifically, we've been asking for a number of years, how much would you support or oppose signing an international treaty that requires the United States to cut its emissions of carbon dioxide 90% by the year 2050? And all through these years, we've seen about 2/3 of Americans say yes. Okay? They would support the United States signing a treaty like that. Do Americans really understand what signing a treaty and cutting 90% emissions would entail? No, of course not. But it does show that they are, at least in principle, quite supportive of international action to deal with this collective threat. Okay, so to summarize, as we've seen, public understanding of climate change declined from 2008 to 2011, but we're starting to see a real rebound. It remains to be seen whether that will stay or continue. Public understanding and concern about climate change is getting better as the economy is improving, and then as they're experiencing one extreme weather event another after another, which does this one thing. It takes what was a global, distant problem, and it brings it home, and it says it's now. Okay? That's a really important piece of communication, and we'll come back to that later in the day. Again, we have continued majority support for a variety of policies as well as an international treaty, but it's not a top priority relative to other issues. And that's in large part because, again, it's still this relatively distant threat, and thus there's a lack of public and political will. And as a result of this relatively low priority, most American politicians don't feel that they have to act, that they will be voted out of office if they don't act, or that they need to be a leader on this issue in order to achieve the level of higher office. So with that, I will now turn it over to Wang Binbin, who will talk about our results from China.
Okay, thanks Tony's comprehensive introduction. As Tony said, introduced, Yale University has conducted this kind of research for more than 5 years. But for China Center for Climate Change Communication, it's our first time to conduct this kind of survey with support from different areas, especially from Yale University. In fact, it's not only in China, but also in developing countries. This is the first survey on climate change communication and the first study in this area. Okay, let's move on to the key findings of the survey. China Center for Climate Change Communication conducted a national television survey in this July and August, and used a combined rural and urban sample, which included 4,169 samples. This study most focused on the current state of public climate change awareness, beliefs, attitudes, policy support, and behaviors. Let's have a look at this finding. It's about knowing. So it's about, obviously, only 7% of Chinese never heard of climate change. So it means around 93% they know at least a little about climate change. So it's about knowing, and then about happening. Very similar data. Also, about 93% Chinese, they said they think climate change is happening. So, I think it's because in China now, climate change is a very hot term. Because not only the government, but also the scientists and also the media, NGOs, they're all talking about climate change. So if you have a chance to visit China, if you can talk about something about climate change, I'm sure no one will see you out. So remember this. And next finding is about the reason about climate change. Compared to the former two data, here we can see there's no much consensus on the reason of climate change. Only about half say that climate change is caused by human activities. So about worry, only 8% they said they are not at all worried about climate change. So it means majority Chinese, they think climate change is, they are worried about climate change, and because they are worried, so it means they will have much interest to know more about climate change, and it will provide more space for government, media, and NGO to contribute more in this area. So personally experience, 60% Chinese think they have personally experienced climate change. It's basically related to the China context. You know, in China, most of Chinese are in rural area. So, and the climate change, who is the witness of climate change? Of course, the people in the rural area, especially the poorest people. And this one is about when do you think climate change will start to harm people in China? And you can see, it doesn't work, okay. 69% people, they say they are being harmed now. So it's related to the last data. And this one, how much do you think about climate change will harm? See here, the same number, 69% Chinese think they agree that climate change will harm future generation a great deal. This chart is very interesting. Because you know there are different phenomena about caused by climate change. We call it extreme weather. So drought is a very typical national disaster in China. So not only the north of China, but also the south of China, they will have this kind of disaster. So we just use this disaster to say the vulnerability. And among all these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these 5 points, we can see the last one, the famines and the food shortage, is not so many people think is happened. It will be caused by the drought. Because we can see the March increase and the March decrease. The famine and the food shortages are they are lower or much higher than the average value. It means their extreme value is we can see it. We can find it from the extreme value. So I think it's because in China, more and more media and the government began to care about climate change, but they are focused on what is climate change. And yes, it's happening in China now, but now we need some basic research on the relationship between food issues, food shortage, and climate change. This one is about some statement. 89% Chinese, they totally agree that government should pay great attention to climate change issue. And here you can see only 46% they agree that its personal behavior changes will influence the solving of climate change issues. It's very interesting here because it can reflect the Chinese thinking habit. You know, China is a big government and small society. So people, Chinese, usually to rely on the government, but not their own self. So when they when they meet some challenge, meet some problem, they will first of all think of yes, I need to go to the government to find some help. So this is why here the government can get the more supported. But this is the problem. You know, no one can address climate change with their own effort. So not only the government, but also the whole society need to pay more attention to climate change. And this is the key point we should be pay more attention to in China, and not only for the government, but also for the some research institute that to call on more people, more general public to fight against climate change. Okay, this one is also majority people think that the government should play the most important actor in addressing climate change. And here the public is not so low, the data here. But the media and the corporation and the NGO is very low. So it's another reality in China. It's very different from US. When I discussed this with Tony, he told me that in US, corporation, the public think corporation should play the most important role, or the important role, to address the climate change. But in China, because China is partly market-oriented society, so it means the government still try to manage the corporation operation. So if the government say yes, we should do, then the corporation will follow up. So it leads to the public, they used to think, yes, it's not the corporation who can decide or who can play the most important role. And related to NGO, in China, I think most of you maybe remember the huge disaster in China, the huge earthquake in 2008, the Sichuan earthquake. And it's that moment that more Chinese began to realize NGOs. There's some organization who calls NGO, environmental NGO or development NGO, they are doing some work in China, and they began to have this kind of awareness. So it's just till now, so far, it's just 4 or 5 years. So it's still a long term for Chinese public to understand and to know more about NGO's contribution. This one's about. This is the last data. This one's about policy support. From the color, you can see the blue color is the support, and means the support, and the red color means oppose. So obviously, the Chinese people, they support policy very well. So actually, in recent years, especially after 2009, Chinese government have made many policy to address climate change, and similarly, they get a very well support. Here's a summary. 93% of Chinese think climate change is happening, and 55% think that climate change is caused by human activities. 78% see they are worried about climate change at different levels. 60% see they have personally experienced the effect of climate change, and 69% think that people in China are already being harmed by climate change. 68% think government should play the most important role in regarding to climate change. So in brief, although most of people say that Copenhagen is a failure, but we can say here, in China, it's just after Copenhagen, around Copenhagen, that the government began to pay more and more attention to climate change issue. So here you can see more and more people began to realize, climate change is happening, climate change is there, and we are being harmed by climate change. But regarding to the reason, to the worry, to the who can play the role in this field, they still have some confusion. So we still have government, media, and NGO, and all the institutions. We can do a lot in this area. Yeah, that's my sharing. Thank you.
Check. There we go. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll do one other comparison because we've just seen the results from the United States and from China. And like I mentioned before, there are a few questions that we asked in the same way in both countries. And so we thought, just for interest, we would show you 4 of those results that compare the 2 different countries side by side. And the first one is one that you see here. Do you think that global warming or climate change, and I should say global warming is the term that's used in the United States, and climate change was the term that's used in China, and there are always translation issues, so that certainly will play an important role in some of this as well. But nonetheless, do you think global warming or climate change is caused mostly by human activities, by natural changes in the environment, some other cause, or none of these because it's not happening? And interestingly, the United States and China are almost identical when it comes to believe that human activities are the cause. It's a majority, but just a slight majority in both countries. But then we come to, is it natural, is it just the result of natural changes? And we find that, interestingly, about 38% of Chinese believe that it's natural, whereas relatively fewer in the United States, 30% say that it is. We'll come back to that in a moment. Also, have you personally experienced the effects of global warming or climate change? Here we see a sharper difference between the 2 countries. 60% of Chinese believe that they have already experienced the impacts in some way or another. Only 38% say that in the United States. When do you think that global warming or climate change will start to harm people in your own country? Okay? And again, here we're seeing a very stark difference. Only 36% of Americans say that they are being harmed right now by climate change. Again, that sense that it's distant, like I was talking about before. By contrast, nearly 7 out of 10 Chinese believe that they are being harmed right now. And that sense of more imminent threat plays out when we ask them the simple question of how worried are you about this issue? And we find that, by and large, the Chinese say that they're both more very worried and somewhat worried about this issue than in the United States. So what might explain some of these contrasting results? Well, I have a few thoughts. We're still working. I mean, this is brand new data actually from China. We just received and started doing this analysis a couple weeks ago. But we have at least got a few speculations that we'll share with you now, and we'd be happy to talk more about this when we get to the Q&A. Back to the issue of is it happening or not? Well, actually, I'll come back to that because we didn't show that. But 93% again of Chinese believe that climate change is happening. Only 70% of Americans believe that it's happening. I would say that some of these differences are because of things like what I talked about before, that we have a very active denial movement in the United States of scientists, of powerful interests, of news organizations that work very closely together to push out a very strong communication message and strategy to raise doubts about the reality of climate change. And I think, again, they've been reasonably successful in that. Also, the U.S. media has played an important role in this issue in that they've given, we have huge insurance schemes in position to help people. The federal government will immediately step in and spend dozens of billions of dollars to help people rebuild their lives. That's certainly not the case in many other countries around the world, and it's not fully the case yet in China either. And the flip side of that, of course, is that many Chinese are still living at or below the poverty line. And then just this last point, again, back to the questioning of the reality of climate change and the seriousness of it, is that climate change has become politicized in the United States, where Democrats and Republicans use this issue to attack each other, to try to score political points. In this past presidential election, we had a very stark example of that, where every single Republican running for the presidency, with the exception of John Huntsman, who didn't last very long, either questioned the reality of climate change or flat out said it was a hoax. Okay? So when one of the two major political parties that represents roughly half the electorate in the country is willing to say as leaders that this is a hoax, it shows you what the kind of political gridlock and even dysfunction that the United States is currently enduring with this issue. And so the United States has a major political problem that we still need to work through in order to get to the bigger issues like what people are talking about here at Doha. Binbin, do you have other comments you'd like to say about the comparison between the two countries?
I think you have given us a very completed analysis, so I'd like to leave more time to the Q&A section, and move ahead, please. Thank you.
Okay. So I think what we'll do is we'll end then, because we got started a little late with the presentation about India's results, and then we can have an open discussion about all three countries. So Jagadish, Thaker.
Well, I know we're all getting hungry, so I'll try to keep my presentation short. So India is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. However, currently we almost know nothing if Indians are aware of climate change, understand the causes, consequences, or potential solutions to mitigate and adapt to climate change impacts. So to assess Indians' climate change awareness, beliefs, their risk perceptions, behavior, and policy support, as well as their perceived vulnerability and resilience to climate change impacts, particularly on water-related issues, Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, along with GlobeScan and Seawater, conducted a national sample survey in November and December 2011. I'm going to spend some time, unlike Tony, in trying to talk about the sampling plan. So what we did was, the primary sampling unit for this climate change in the environment survey was the parliamentary constituency units in 21 out of the 35 Indian states and union territories. And at least one assembly constituency, which is a local body, state level, local political unit, was randomly selected using a random number generator. From each of such randomly selected assembly constituency, we again randomly selected one polling station. And following the electorate list provided by the India, the first respondent was randomly selected, followed by every 10th respondent on the list. If the respondent was absent or refused to participate in the survey, the next respondent was was asked to participate in the interview, followed by the next 10th respondent, and so on. So following this stratified random sampling plan, we covered 134 urban, semi-urban, and rural communities in 21 out of 35 Indian states and union territories, representing 98% of the Indian population. Overall, a total of 4,031 respondents completed face-to-face interviews, which lasted about 40 minutes, resulting in a response rate of 40% and a margin of error at 1.54%. The data set was weighted to match the actual age, gender, religious, and regional distribution of the target population. Moreover, the questionnaire was translated into 12 major Indian languages, including Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi, Telugu, and others, because India is such a linguistically diverse country. However, the presentation here is from the complete sample, which has a strong urban bias, where 3 by 4 of the respondents come from the large, medium, or the small cities. Now, the first question refers to how much do they know about global warming. When we ask this to the respondents, we find that 41% of the respondents say that they either never have heard of it or they don't know the term global warming. Only a minority, 7%, say that they know a lot about it. What this shows is that a majority of Indians are not aware of climate change and may lack climate change as a conceptual framework to make sense of the observed changes in their local area and to make decisions about the future. Because we know that Indians are largely unaware of climate change from other issues, from other surveys as well, we followed the awareness question with a brief description of what global warming means. We said, global warming refers to the idea that the world's average temperature has been increasing over the past 150 years, maybe increasing more in the future, and that the world's climatic and weather patterns may change as a result. What do you think? Do you think global warming is happening? When we provided just two-line definition of what global warming means, we find that 2 out of 3 respondents said yes, it is happening. While most of the Indians may not be aware of climate change, and many have never heard of the term global warming or climate change, but we find that when we provide a short description of what it means, it seems to resonate with the lived experience. When asked if global warming is primarily caused by human activities or as a result of natural changes in the environment, we find that 6 out of 10 respondents say that it's mostly caused by human activities. Another 31% say that it's mostly caused by natural changes in the environment. And only a minority, 2%, say that it's not happening at all. When asked how worried are they about global warming, only 20% said that they are very worried about global warming. An additional 41%, the highest single response, said that they are somewhat worried about global warming. We find that a majority of our respondents perceive high vulnerability to climate change impacts, including they feel they're personally vulnerable, their family is vulnerable, people in their community and people in India are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But they feel that the risks are far greater for future generations of people and for plants and animal species. When asked when do you think that global warming will start to harm people in India, we find that 21% say they are being harmed right now. Another 22% say that they will be harmed in 10 years. But a majority, 57%, say that the harmful impacts of global warming are at least a generation away. There's a 25 years or 50 years, or as 6% say never. So the majority, the 57%, feel that the impacts are at least, the harmful impacts of global warming are at least a generation away. Apart from understanding climate change awareness, beliefs and risk perceptions, the Climate Change in Indian Minds survey was also interested to understand perceived vulnerability to climate change impacts. And when we asked, if a 1-year-long severe drought happened in your local area, how big an impact would it have on each of the following? And we find that more than 50% of our respondents feel that their water supply, their food supply, their health and income are highly vulnerable to the impact of a severe extreme weather event such as severe drought. And let me remind you that extreme weather events such as severe droughts and floods may increase in frequency and intensity due to climate change. Just as important as vulnerability is resilience, meaning how long would a household or a community take to recover from an extreme weather event? And we find that over 50% or more than 60% of our respondents said that they would take several months to several years to recover from an impact of an extreme weather event such as severe drought or severe flood. In other words, Indians more generally perceive low resilience to the impacts of extreme weather events, again, which might increase in frequency and intensity due to climate change. When asked how big of an effort should India make to reduce global warming, and we find that 77% of our respondents said that 77% of our respondents support a national plan to reduce global warming, including over a third of the respondents supporting a large-scale effort, even if it has large economic costs. Although the question is kind of abstract, because what's the difference between a large economic cost and a small economic cost? But the answers do indicate an overall willingness to act on global warming, even if it has some economic costs. When asked when should India reduce emission, we find that the single highest response. 38% say that India should reduce its own emissions immediately without waiting for other countries. That about 4 out of 10 respondents say that India should act unilaterally without waiting for other countries and reduce its emissions. However, 44% of our respondents say that either that India should not reduce its emissions under any circumstances or should do so only when other countries act. Finally, we asked them about a variety of policy support measures that the Government of India has proposed as part of its National Action Plan. And we find that a majority of our respondents support these policies, including saving water, energy, and forests, reducing the number of coal-fired power plants, increasing investment in renewable energy sources, and increasing water access by encouraging local communities to build check dams. The highest policy that they supported, however, is a national program to teach all Indians about global warming, where we find 70% of our respondents support that plan. In other words, it seems that Indians want to know more about global warming, which is again reflected the first question, where we saw that 41% of the respondents either said they have never heard or don't know about climate change. Just to summarize, we find that only 7% of Indians know a lot about global warming. But when we provide just a 2-line definition of what it means, we find a complete reversal, where we find that 2 out of 3 respondents agree that global warming is happening. Moreover, 56% or 6 out of 10 respondents think that global warming is mostly human caused. Only 20% of Indians feel very worried about climate change, and most of them perceive it to be distant in time, that is going to happen in next generation, and impacting other species such as animal and plants. A large majority of Indians say that their household is vulnerable to extreme weather events, and they also say that they might take several months to several years to recover from an extreme weather event in the local area. And finally, majority of our respondents said that they support national action to reduce emissions, even if these policies increase consumer costs. Thank you so much.
Okay, so what we're going to do now then is just, we'll each take just a couple minutes to say a few words about what we think these results, what are some of the insights that we're learning from these studies, and what they might mean for climate communication in each of our respective countries. So I'm going to go first, then we'll hear a little bit from China, and then a little bit from India, and then it's all about opening it up, and let's have a conversation from all of you. Okay, so one of the things that we've discovered in the United States as well in this research is that there are 3 things that, of course, are so crucial to any effective communications. Your audience, your message, and your messenger. And in audiences, it's one of the first rules of effective communication is you must know who your audience is. Who are they? Where do you find them? What do they understand? What do they think they understand? What are their values? Where do they get their news and information from? Whom do they trust? You need to know all of that, otherwise it's like playing darts in a crowded room with the lights off. You might hit the target sometimes, but most often you're going to miss. And sometimes you're going to cause collateral damage. You're going to hit an innocent bystander and cause a backlash effect. Communication is the same thing. You need to know who you're trying to reach and how to reach them. And in the United States, we've realized that the American public doesn't speak with a single voice. There's in fact many publics within the United States, and when it comes to the issue of climate change, we've identified 6 distinct Americas that each respond to this issue in very different ways. I won't talk about them much here, but this kind of insight is now being used by organizations all over the United States, from the federal government, state government, local government. Corporations are using this. Educators are using this. Zoos, aquariums, and museums are using this framework to try and understand who are they trying to engage with. Which of these audiences are in their constituency or in their market. So they range from the alarmed, just very quickly, who are firmly convinced climate change is happening, human caused, and an urgent threat, all the way down to the dismissive who are convinced that it's not happening, not human caused, and in fact many believe it's a hoax. And then in between are different types of views. But another key thing that we've learned is that the message really matters. As I said before, most Americans, in fact 99.99999% of Americans do not know a climate scientist personally. They do not read scientific journals. They have never even heard of the IPCC report. Okay? We actually ask people, have you ever heard of the IPCC? Okay, I won't even take the time to ask you to guess. It's 14% of Americans have ever heard of the IPCC. 14%. After decades of news reports and so on about the IPCC and the thing that we all assume everybody knows about, no, we live within a very green climate change bubble. Okay? Everyone in this room is very different than the vast majority of the planet. Most people have never heard of the IPCC. So we have to recognize that for most people, yes, you always want to make as much information available and transparently available for people as possible, and you want to make it and explain it in ways that people can understand. Absolutely, for anyone who's interested to learn more. But at the same time, we have to recognize that most people are not going to go get a college degree in climatology. They're not going to study the IPCC reports. They're not going to go read those journal articles or anything. So the challenge for the communication community is really this. If you have maybe 5 ideas, and I'm making that number up, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 7, but it's some small number of ideas that they have mental space for you to get into their heads, what 5 ideas should they know about climate change that will allow them to make good decisions going forward? Okay? Now this is an open question, and it's an open question in every society. Every country may be different. But in the United States right now, our best estimate, as of now, but we're still doing work, is that it basically boils down to this. 10 words. It's real. It's us that's causing it. It's going to be bad, especially for human beings, not just polar bears. That scientists are in agreement about this fact, and there's hope that there are solutions ready at hand to take action. Okay? And that can be done in ways that actually will help the economy and grow jobs and so on. Most people don't understand all 5 of these. And moreover, what we've learned is that that one idea that the experts agree is what we call a gateway belief, because it turns out that your correct understanding of this shapes everything else. I mean, again, most people don't know anything about climate change. Just like most people don't know anything about nanotechnology, or biotechnology, or genetically modified food, or SARS, or any of the risks that the world faces today. In fact, I dare say most of us aren't experts in all of those topics I just raised. And in that situation, you want to know, well, what do the people who are expert in this think? What do the experts think? And if your perception is that the experts themselves don't agree about whether it's even happening, then why would you take that risk seriously? Okay? All of us are in that same situation, and most of the public is as well. And so what we find is that when people correctly understand that the experts agree that climate change is happening and human caused, they become much more likely themselves to say it's happening, human caused, it's going to be bad for people, and that it's solvable, and in turn, they then support climate policy and more actions by everyone in society, including themselves. So we think this is one of the most important messages that we need to communicate in the United States. Last point is about bringing it back home, making it real for people, so it's not some abstract, distant threat to people in places far away. And what we have begun is a major national project working with the nation's weathercasters, TV and radio broadcast meteorologists, who actively have the eyes and ears of the vast majority of the American public. Climate scientists could be much better communicators. Many of them are not great communicators, but they could be much better. But in the end, they don't scale. They give a talk to 100 people here and 100 people there and the occasional reporter, but they have day jobs. You know, they're supposed to do their science, and it just doesn't reach hundreds of millions of people. Weathercasters, however, are one of the most important players in American media because they reach hundreds of millions of Americans every day, 3 to 4 times a day. And they're highly trusted, and people watch them. And so what we're beginning to see with, for instance, the extreme weather events is that they have the ability to educate Americans about this issue. And so they're, in some ways, ideal messengers to reach Americans about climate change. Okay, I'll leave it there. Binbin, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. So in China, I think at the very beginning why we conducted this program is because in Copenhagen we found China really played a passive role in the negotiation because the government was not very familiar with the roles in this negotiation. For example, in the second week when there are some many scandal to China government, so the government feels very nervous and don't know how to communicate with the world. So at that moment, we think yes, we need to do something to help the government to open dialogue with the civil society, with the world, to tell them how to do it. So this is the very beginning why we have this program. But time by time we think, as we observed, now in the international negotiation platform, China began to play more and more open actor, and they have arranged many regular meetings with media, with NGOs. Although there are still some, place to improve, but at least they are trying to try their best. So we are thinking, then how can we do? Then at the moment we think, Tony gave us a very vital suggestion that we need to do something nationally, internally. So we began to focus on how to, how to persuade people to believe climate change. In China also, there are not so many people. Maybe when they answer our questionnaire about do you believe in climate change, they will say yes, but in their deep heart, when we talk about climate change, or especially in the field when we talk about climate change, not so many colleagues think climate change really happen. Partly, of course, because the scientists didn't give us a very strong voice on climate change still is happening. But from our perspective, we think because climate change is related to environment issue, to development issue, but both these two issues are related to the sustainable development of human beings. So this is the first point. The second point is, in China, we really found there are so many people around 900 million people live in rural area, and they are really affected by climate change. So we have experienced so many stories, and we have talked with them, and we know what happened in their life. So we think, personally, yes, not only from the general meaning and from the personal perspective, addressing climate change is very important, and we should let more people know this. And the principle is no regret. And the second one is climate change have a very comprehensive meaning. For example, in negotiation area, not only the mitigation but also adaptation to perspective. But most of people in China, they only know, when they talk about climate change, yes, it's an environmental issue, and it's about the low carbon, it's about the mitigation, but not so many people know. There are so many, our brothers, our sisters in rural area have been impacted by climate change. So this is why we think it's very important. We also do climate change communication in China to let them know, climate change is not only related to the bear in in the faraway area, and but also in our family, just in China. So this is another point. And regarding this point, China Center for Climate Change have conducted many side events, seminars, and we also released a new campaign in China. It's a public education campaign we try to call on more people to go to the rural area, go to community, go to the corporation and university to teach more people, to let more people know what is climate change and what climate change impact, diverse impact. And the third point is about media use. We can see very obviously Chinese media, when they report in Chinese, their experience are not so colorful compared to the international colleagues. So this is also what we can do from a climate change communication perspective to help them and give them more chances to know about, to know how to report climate change and how to play a much more useful role in this communication process. And the last but not least one is about policy makers. Chinese government, they now pay more and more attention to climate change, not only on the international level, but also national. So we think how to make a useful and very efficient policy. They need to know the public opinion. So the civil society in China need to grow up as soon as possible. And one of the reasons why we conducted this program is we want to help the civil society to grow up, and also, we can help the media, help the NGO, and to learn, to know, to hear the voice from the rural area, from the general public, and thus they can transfer this voice to the government. And thus when the government makes a policy, they can think about, yes, which policy is much better to the people in China. And we can see China government just released their China's policies and actions for addressing climate change just before Doha, and they concluded all their policies in China. And they also mentioned this time is their first time to highlight what NGOs' contribution, and they also introduced China Center for Climate Change Communications survey in China as well. And it means they really began to think about what general Chinese is thinking. And I think it's very vital and it's a milestone for China. Thank you.
Okay, then JT, you have some thoughts about India.
Yeah, quickly. Thank you, Tony and Vivian. And I'm just going to rephrase what Tony said and what I learned from in ABAC, the Center for Climate Change Communication in US. And this is the dictum for communication. Simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted sources. That is going to get us public involved to support policy and to change their behaviors. Let me say that again. Simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted sources. Now, with reference to the climate change India data, we find that only 7% say they know a lot about it, but when we provided just two-line definition, we see a complete turnaround. We see 72% of our respondents saying that yes, it is happening, and that's the biggest communication lesson that we got of this climate change in Indian Mind survey, that they want to connect the dots between what they're experiencing locally and they want to know what's happening in the global scale so that they can take better decisions at the local scale. So let me divide the communication dictum into three parts. What kind of information they want, who do they want to hear it from, and what kind of policies that they want to support. So what kind of information they want to hear, I think they want to hear more about the localized impacts of our climate change, how their community, the place that they are living is going to get affected by extreme weather events or the impacts of other climate change impacts. Specifically, how is that personally going to affect my health? How is it going to affect my income? Those are the kind of information that they want to hear about it. Who do they want to hear it from? And this is another thing that we asked in the survey, and you can find a complete report in the reception area, that the Indians trust scientists more often. Indians trust scientists most among the different sources of information. The next being your family and friends and the environmental organizations. So, and then it's the media organizations. And as some of you might know, that Indian media coverage actually has been very sporadic. the Indian media covers about climate change only during such events such as COP18, and then rest of the years there's hardly any coverage. So we want Indian media to cover more and more consistently and more in depth, and perhaps cover issues that the local that would affect the local communities, the kind of information that they can use. Finally, what kind of policies that they want to support is kind of an important thing, and we found that a majority of Indians support a variety of policies, even if they have to pay up a little more to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So we should try getting more public support to push the government to act on climate change, and as well as the government should aggressively implement more communication programs in India, apart from just talking high in the international conferences.
Great, thank you, JT. So now we finally get to open it up and have a discussion among all of us. Let's see, could I, Bessie? Bessie?
Bessie.
Could I borrow you so we can let people talk into the microphone when they have questions to ask or comments? Okay, so does this work? Oh, you got some right there. Fantastic. Okay. So let's start right here in the front. And if you could please introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Vanessa Casano from the Carbon Disclosure Project, and I wanted to thank the speakers for their very insightful work. It's been really fascinating morning. So my question really, and I suppose it's directed to Tony, is you talked about the sources of information that influence public opinion, and you pointed to the media. I just wanted to ask if the research considered the role of corporations, and specifically the corporate positions, public positions, and the mismatch between the lobbying work that they do and their government engagement and their public information. So that's my question.
Okay, so the question is basically what's the role of corporations in this mix as well as public views of corporations?
Yeah, and the inconsistencies between what corporations are telling governments and what the corporations are telling the public, and what that impact is on public opinion.
Sure. Okay. This is a big topic. I think one of the most important things to recognize is that corporations are not homogeneous. There are many, many, many different kinds of corporations, and they have many different positions on this issue. As we know, there are many corporations that have very publicly said, we believe climate change is real, we think climate change is human caused, we think that climate change is a serious risk. It's a serious risk to our bottom line as a direct risk. It's potentially a liability risk to us, as well as it's also a potentially enormous market opportunity, because somebody is going to make the trillions of dollars in the clean energy economy. So who is that going to be? Is that going to be my company, or is that going to be somebody else's company or some other country? So I think, first of all, corporations, just like Americans don't have a single voice, corporations don't have a single voice either, and we need to give a lot of credit to those that are engaging the issue. That said, there have been a set of companies that have seen it in their own self-interest to fight this issue for many years. Though that has changed in about the past 10 to 15 years in the United States. There used to be an organization called the Global Climate Coalition in the United States, made up primarily of manufacturers, fossil fuel companies, and so on, that were united in funding lots of other groups to say that climate change isn't happening, and funding scientists to go and try to provide a lot of misinformation and so on. That organization doesn't exist anymore. That organization completely fell apart. The manufacturers, the automakers, they pulled out. They now think climate change is serious. A number of oil companies pulled out because they too have changed their public position on it. And so what you're left with now in the United States is really an anti-climate science movement that, while it's getting some support from the fossil fuel industry, and I'm not going to name names, but there are a few that are still funding them, it's really driven much more by free market ideology now than it is by fossil fuel interests. And it's also gotten much more widespread among people who are not getting paid anything. If you look at the discussions about climate change on the internet, most of those people are not getting a salary. They're not getting money from anybody. They're just trying to express their views, which are, again, often rooted in a very deep free market ideology. So the issue has gotten much, much more complicated and thus much more interesting. Last point. Americans fundamentally don't trust corporations on this issue. When we ask people, how much do you trust them as a source of information, they are at the absolute bottom of the list. So I think the only way corporations can actually be powerful voices on this is when they cut against stereotype. People expect that corporations are going to be anti-environmental. They expect that corporations are going to be anti-climate change. And when a company comes out and says, no, we think this is a serious problem and we think we can be part of the solution, I think that works in their favor. So I actually do think corporations can play a really important role in communicating this issue.
All three of you mentioned deficiencies in media coverage in your countries, and also, Tony, you talked about the importance of media in terms of, getting people to be concerned, to be aware. How do you explain the real discrepancy between what we see in terms of awareness in China versus the U.S.? I mean, is there a real difference in how the media covers climate change in China? Do they draw the connections between extreme weather events and impacts with the issue of climate change? What are the differences there?
First of all, I think that's a great question, and it's a great research question. So if you want a job, come see me. But we don't, I think we don't fully know the answer to that yet because we haven't done the media analysis across all three countries. But Binbin, I think you probably could say something about how the Chinese media has been talking about climate change.
I think Chinese media, there are two categories. Chinese media, when they began to follow up climate change issue, is from Copenhagen. So this is why I think Copenhagen really cannot just simply be named as a failure. And they began to talk about climate change since Copenhagen and follow up the negotiation from a very, use some technical terms. But this kind of news is not so welcomed by Chinese public because it's too technical and it's a bit difficult for the general public to understand. So now we are providing training for the Chinese media, and we are discussing how to provide some vivid stories, and we take them to the rural area, and we just arrange some interview for the media and ask them to provide them some chances to interview the rural witness, and thus they can write some better stories. And also, they will follow up the policy, of course. They will write some analysis, write some comments to the latest policy, and also inviting the expert to make some analysis. But I think, yes, it's in fact the media coverage and is just as what the government is, the Chinese government is doing. They are all at the very, very beginning in climate change issue. So this is why I think we can, as a center on climate change communication, we can contribute in this field. Yeah.
And I'll just add two other quick comments. I mean, there are some important other differences between the two countries. First of all, as I mentioned before, the United States has an active disinformation movement, okay, that has been very active in the U.S. media. And so that has had, I think, a significant impact on public opinion. You do not see a parallel disinformation movement in China or in India or, frankly, anywhere else in the world other than Canada, the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Interestingly, all English-speaking countries. Not to say that you won't find an occasional skeptic somewhere, but by and large, that is not a common discourse in other countries or other media. The other big difference, I think, between the U.S. and China, and in the sense that the U.S. has been talking about climate change for a lot longer as part of public discourse, and as Binbin says, it's much newer of a topic in China, so there's a lot more to be done. However, there's also a major difference in the media between the two countries. China's media is much more concentrated and consolidated, with much of the country watching Chinese national television, whereas we lost that world when Walter Cronkite stopped reporting in the United States. I mean, that was decades ago. The American media is so fragmented now, where Americans don't share a single media universe anymore. We all have our own media sources that many people increasingly build around themselves of a hall of self-reflecting mirrors. You can choose the media source that gives you the opinions and the viewpoints that you already agree with, as opposed to hearing a viewpoint that's different than your own. So the U.S. media landscape is much, much more complicated, I think, than what you see in China, at least currently. But that's changing. That's changing in China, too. Okay, next question.
My name is Sayyid Khatari. I'm from Jordan, representing Jordan Environment Society, NGO. Well, the three of you have introduced a very nice academic exercise. And it looks like a debate between China and the States. As NGOs, we do not care much about what you are debating in the communication or any other issues. As NGOs, we have a message, we have questions to be addressed to you. First of all, I hope that I'm addressing the right people. Our worries, are you admitting that your countries are the most polluting countries on this earth? The other thing, are your countries going to sign the charters, the protocols concerning the global warming or climate change? Are you going to meet your responsibilities in front of those victims or countries that cannot meet the emergencies as in the States, as you just mentioned? The time has come really to see that the polluter pays issue be implemented, and everyone has to stand courageously against or to meet their responsibilities. This is our worries as NGOs, our worries about people. We do care about your nice academic exercise and whatever information you have submitted, but at the same time we'd like to see something on the ground to meet really how to mitigate, how to stop, how to deal with the climate change issues. We know that the States, maybe they care about baseball and football and whatever other hobbies, but in the rest of the world, they are worried about their food, about their health, about whatever issues you just mentioned. And this is my message as NGOs. And thank you for the information you just introduced. And I'm an academician, as you are. I'm a professor at the University of Jordan. And I'd like to see that we are also, as let's say, educated people, to meet our responsibilities and not to go with the stream of just giving information without action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, you're raising really important and fundamental issues that obviously are a key part of the negotiations here in Doha. In regards to at least the American public, and I don't think we know enough about the Indian public or the Chinese public. Again, most people are incredibly local in their entire worldview. I think most Americans actually have very limited understanding of the way the rest of the world is, or lives, or these broader responsibilities. So, as an example, we don't see that Americans fully understand their unique historic role in greenhouse gas emissions over time. So these discussions that are so central to the negotiations here about who has historic responsibility for the current amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, they don't understand that. They don't understand the concept of per capita emissions fully. The governments. Sure. Okay, yes. Yes, you're absolutely right. The policymakers, I think, well, let me even say that. Certain policymakers do understand. There are also many policymakers within the United States government who do not understand. They simply do not. And this is why the U.S. Congress is not willing to ratify the treaty. This is why it was never put forward by Kyoto Protocol was never put forward by the Clinton administration, because they knew they could not get it passed by the U.S. Senate. So there are actually many policymakers within the United States who do not understand some of these key factors. Moreover, the United States is fundamentally a democracy. And so the leaders are constrained or enabled by what their people believe and demand of them. And that's one of the main reasons why we think that public opinion actually matters. Beyond the fact that the public, in its choices as consumers, as users of energy, and all of their other climate and energy related behaviors, also has to play an important role. But in the end, you're absolutely right. This is an issue that has to be taken up by policymakers. The question is, how do we get policymakers to take this issue seriously? That's the real challenge. One of the ways that we get there is through the public. It's not the only way. There are many other pressures on policymakers. But one of the important ways, at least in a democracy, is to engage the public to demand action.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panel for the presentation. I think it's been really informative. My name is Ray Wills. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Western Australia, and also from Perth in Australia, and also former CEO of the Sustainable Energy Association of Australia, which is an industry chamber where businesses are responding. So very interested in the words. Rupert Murdoch's News Limited and News Corp have clearly played a huge role in the media right across the world. Rupert, of course, is from Australia, and one of his CEOs in Australia is famous for saying that news gets in the way of good advertising. And the challenge in that context is that we also know that right-wing commentary publications get more revenue than left-wing publication commentary. And so there is a tendency, particularly in Australia, but no doubt also in the US, for that commentary to be more extreme, and we know that when it is more extreme, they see more advertising revenue. So that's a critical challenge in the context of how this message gets out there. But I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to go down to two. The first one really is in relation to the US. One view of the data might be that the absence of media reporting has improved public understanding. And I guess the second part of the question is in fact for China, and there's been some commentary to that already, and that is there any negative reporting of climate change in the Chinese press? Do we understand this? And I think one of the things that differs between particularly China and the USA, of course, as the climate change models tell us, and as the experience shows us, is that China is far more exposed, as is Australia, to climate change than the US is. The actual outcomes for climate change in the US, climatically, are relatively modest compared to China and Australia and Africa. India and in fact the US in the climate change models don't do quite so bad. Everybody does badly, but not quite so much. So I actually wonder how much of that climate impact that's really experienced in China already has been important, and the fact that there appears to be no negative reporting in China of the reporting of the skeptics in China. Thank you.
Great couple of comments. Thank you very much. I'm not going to comment much on the idea that extreme views leads to more money, but I do think you're raising the critical point that the media is a business. In most places, it's a business. And so they will make decisions about what to report based on their assessment of will this bring eyeballs or not. That's one of the reasons why we are trying to find other kinds of communication channels than simply the news media. The news media will play an important role, but we believe, for instance, weathercasters is another important communication channel. But it's not that alone. We need to be engaging communicators across society, companies, faith community, health professionals, the military. I mean, all of us in the end in a society are communicators. including with our own friends and family. And all of them need to be engaged in having a national and even international conversation about this issue. About the question of has the absence of media reporting actually improved public understanding? I mean, that's a really funny comment. And I'll just say this, is that when it comes to the extreme weather story, okay, for a long time, scientists have had a basic talking point, and you all know this talking point. You can never say that any one extreme weather event was caused by climate change, right? That is the standard scientific qualifying answer to this question. Whenever an extreme weather event happens, they say, well, you can never say this was caused by climate change. So they always refuse to talk about it. Likewise, the media wouldn't talk about it either. I don't know how many stories I saw in 2011 about the latest extreme weather event, and someone would say, so does this have anything to do with broader trends? And nobody would answer the question. So the media wasn't really talking about it. And yet we found in our data that Americans themselves were starting to connect the dots. Okay? And the point there is really important, and that is that people are not empty vessels waiting to be told what to think by the media or politicians or anyone else. They are actively making meaning out of their own experience. And the fact is that when people see, there's an old saying, if you see something once, it's happenstance. If it happens twice, it's coincidence. If it happens 3 times, you're beginning to see a pattern. When it happens 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, 7 times, 8 times, and in the United States it has been over 20 times of just record-setting extreme events, people themselves start connecting the dots. They are actively trying to interpret this new reality, and themselves are saying, maybe this has something to do with climate change. So in that case, I think the media and scientists and everybody else can do a really important role in helping people solidify those connections, to understand when they actually make sense. We do know there's a relationship between climate change and, say, extreme record-setting temperatures, and also where it doesn't make sense. You can't say that climate change is causing tornadoes. There's just no science that shows the direct link there. So the main thing is that these are teachable moments. They're one of the few times in American media landscape when Americans are actually paying attention to an issue, extreme weather, that is closely related to climate change, and not thinking about the latest celebrity or the latest scandal or what's going on in the government or all the other topics that we focus on.
Thanks for your question about China. And actually, Chinese government conducting a national report, a national strategy report on adaptation, climate change adaptation. Yes, and there are many national surveys were conducted in the past years. And here I have 2 group of data to provide. And the first one is, in China, poverty-stricken areas have a strong correlation to ecologically fragile areas, and their geographical distribution is equally very similar. This below is data in 1997, and 74% of those living in sensitive ecological areas are in impoverished counties, accounting for roughly 81% of the total population in impoverished counties. And according to statistics from the Ministry of Environmental Protection, this is another data in 2007, 59% of the people living in the absolute poverty are living in ecological damaged areas in the interior of the country. So the percentage of the people living in poverty affected by climate change is expected to grow. And here I have another data, it's just from the latest white paper before Doha. The first paragraph of the forward is, in 2011 alone, natural disaster affected 430 million people and caused direct economic losses of 309.6 billion. Yeah, hope useful. Yeah. I can give you the linkage of this report if you want.
I mean, I was sure that why you feel that India is less exposed to climate change, because when we look at the impacts, we look at the three-dimension exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And some of the Indian cities, Mumbai, Calcutta, Chennai, are all, they have high density of population living on the seashore, which is, highly vulnerable to sea level rise. And also, just like China, majority of people are still under the poverty line, or just subsidizing right above it. So any kind of extreme weather event is going to highly impact their ability to access food. And this is, again, India is a highly agriculture-based economy where more than 50% of the population is still involved in agriculture, which is, again, practiced with traditional tools, not mechanized. So any kind of change in, for example, the rainfall patterns or increasing intensity or severity of extreme weather events is highly vulnerable and going to push the population to even down. The kind of development that India has seen over the last 20 years after India opened its economy, that is under threat because of climate change. So the development that we have seen for 2 decades is under threat because of climate change, and might push the people who are just about poverty line back into it.
Next question.
Steve Sawyer from Global Wind Energy Council. Just want to get your reaction to a string of observations. You said that the Global Climate Coalition has gone away. I would say that it's come back. Not in the same form, but if you look at the amount of money that was spent to basically get the Republican Party to adopt the previous positions of the Global Climate Coalition in the last election, it's extraordinary. And, you say the US is a democracy. Well, technically speaking, it's a republic, and there's a fundamental difference. It is possible to elect a president without him getting the majority of votes, as has happened several times in the history. But I would go a bit further and say that it's bordering on the edge of a plutocracy, especially with the Supreme Court systems, which allows the fossil fuel industry to put unlimited money, basically, into the outcome of the election, mostly through buying the media. Then you get to the point where the very interesting list of countries that history of the world, get out of direct politics in order for this sort of sanity to prevail.
Great set of observations and questions. You're absolutely right. They still have a fair amount of power, and certain interests within the United States have, and I think in particular, it's no shock to you certainly, are groups like the Koch brothers, which is an interesting combination not only of incredible fossil fuel self-interest, they are mostly from the fossil fuel industry, but they are also hardcore free market, individualistic worldview, libertarian type ideology, and it's the fusion of those in those owners, private owners of that particular company, and they have been tremendous funders of a lot of this disinformation campaign. So, yeah, absolutely, they haven't disappeared by any means. I think what you're raising, though, are fundamental questions that the United States is struggling with right now about its democracy. And, it's all throughout the system. It's the way we make decisions in the Senate. The fact that you need 60 votes to pass anything now because of the filibuster rule. These are tiny bureaucratic rules, and they have an enormous impact on the American government's ability, or actually inability, to actually take action on a whole host of issues, climate change just being one of them. So, I think I have to say, as an observer of American politics is pretty dysfunctional across the board right now. And I think the current discussions in Washington over the fiscal cliff is just more evidence of their inability to actually work together to solve common problems. Again, climate change just you add that one to a very long list of problems the United States hasn't been able to deal with. And we've got some big structural issues, like the way that money is able to influence political speech in our country. So, yes, we've got things to work on. And maybe we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll split for lunch.
Thanks. I'm Jonathan Lin. I'm the head of communications at the IPCC, and I've got a couple of questions and observations, more on a personal than on a additional capacity, otherwise I'll get shot. Coming back to this topic of the impact of extreme events in the United States on people's awareness of climate change, I've heard it said often that when weathercasters talk about them, typically they don't make the link to climate change. The events are treated in the abstract. I'd be interested to hear your view, whether that's the case and what if anything can be done. And as a suggestion maybe for future work for the China Centre, it would be very interesting to see how public awareness in China of climate change develops, but with personal exposure to extreme events rather than a general awareness. You mentioned, Tony, in your presentation the fact that a majority in the United States supports an international treaty for action, and yet it's not happening in the United States. And similarly, in the Chinese survey, we see that 89% of Chinese people say the government should pay attention to the issue. 68% the government has the most important actor in this. So again, it would be interesting to see whether that public pressure has any impact or any effect on the stance of Chinese negotiators in these sorts of negotiations. And we talked about the low understanding in the media of climate change in China and India, even the United States. And I think it's very important. Been mentioned this. It's very important to have some kind of training for media in climate change, science-based training, so workshops. We're even talking about doing something like that in the United States for journalists who are based at the United Nations there. So the IPCC and the UN are looking at doing something there. As you know, the UNFCCC organises workshops for journalists in developing countries, but I think it would be well worth looking at ways of doing that in China and India and other countries too. And just by the by, I'm really speaking personally here now, those sort of workshops should look at the stance of the national policy and national negotiations, but they won't always overlap 100% with a general understanding of climate change. And then Tony, you and Jagadish talked about the need for simple, clear messages, and the IPCC puts out these massive reports. We do produce summaries for policymakers, which are 15, 18, 20 pages long. Even they are pretty hard for the non-specialists to make sense of. And I know that a lot of people, NGOs and others, produce what we call derivative products. So they produce translations and, for want of a better word, idiots' guides to the IPCC report. And it would be very interesting to see what could be done in China and India on that. And in China, there's the additional dimension of translation as well. But it would be interesting to explore how we do that. I know the IPCC can't give its stamp of approval on something like that. It can certainly help informally with making sure that those derivative products are accurate. So, thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Great points, and so let me pick up on a couple of them. First of all, to your first point about weathercasters, most do not talk about climate change right now. Most do not. But we've actually surveyed that community twice, and we know that about 20% of them would like to do so. They say, I believe it's happening, I think it's human caused, I think it's my responsibility as part of my job to help my viewers understand this issue because it's going to directly impact them. But they say they don't because they lack the training, they lack the materials, they don't have the pictures, the graphics, the animations, the scripts that they can immediately go on air and deliver. And they say, if you help me, if you support me with that, I'll start talking about climate change tomorrow. I mean, I'm being a little exaggerated, but you get the idea. So we've actually developed a national network of institutions, including NASA and NOAA and their own associations, the American Meteorological Society, the National Weather Association, the broadcast meteorologists themselves, to come together to support broadcast meteorologists as communicators. So to support those that are already ready to do it, and then secondly, to train those that are still trying to make up their mind. They're still not sure, because this isn't their field either. They're not experts in climate science. So we've been holding workshops all across the country where we sit them down with some of the world's leading climate scientists to answer their questions. What is the difference between a climate model and a weather model? You know, how can you be so sure that you know that it's human caused and not caused by the sun or whatever? And so we've already developed models and are beginning to scale that up across the country. So there's very active work taking place there. Internationally, Climate Communication Day is being sponsored by, I think it's the Internews organization that works internationally, and they are doing media trainings for journalists around the world to get and bringing them to these international conferences. So I think that's at least a start towards what ultimately needs to be done. Last point is your thing on public support for international treaties. And you used a word that I think is actually, I'm going to change it and say why I think it's important. I think what we see there is that the American public has support for, has given their permission for an international treaty. But that is not the same thing as pressure for an international treaty. And that's the fundamental difference. Americans, in general, have basically told their political leaders, yes, we want you to do things that are going to help. Investing in clean energy, ending fossil fuel subsidies, regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant, passing an international treaty. They support all of that. But what they're not doing is demanding that they change. There right now is no organized, mobilized, powerful political force in the United States akin to the civil rights movement or the women's movement or any other social movements you want to name that's out there actually demanding that politicians act. I think that's one of the missing ingredients, at least in the United States.
My quick feedback to Jonathan's advice. I think most of your comments are advice, good advice for our center. And the first feedback is about the further survey. We are planning to do the segment survey with Yale University in the coming weeks, and we also will do the further survey on the specific perspective in the coming months. So, of course, if we can get IPCC, get Jonathan's help, that will be wonderful. So the second feedback is, yes, you mentioned whether the government feel the public pressure. Yes, I think so, because we just shared our survey report with the Chinese government before they released this white paper. It's just a few days before they release this one. But when we read this one, we found our suggestions have been included in this white paper. So this is why I think yes, it's a good evaluation for our work, and I think the government have felt they need to do more to learn the public's voice, especially in climate change area. And the third one is about the training, and you give us a good suggestion that we can do the further training about to the media, and especially with some experts from IP, such as IPCC and other specific institutes help and support. Of course, I think just like the COP18 slogan, count me in. I think not count me in, but count you in. Count all of you in. That will be wonderful, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I don't think we can actually do better than that. So I know it's time for lunch. We're going to be here, and we encourage you all to come ask us questions and also to talk with each other. So thank you all for, again, coming on a Sunday morning, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.